Hi everyone, I think we're going to start this webinar now. There'll be a few more people joining us as we go along. So good evening to you. My name's Claire Searley and I'm the CEO and founding director of the Australian POTS Foundation, and sitting next to me here is Dr. Celine Gallagher, and she's the chair of our scientific committee.
Good evening everyone.
So we'll be your moderators today, and on screen we have Luke Hassan, and I'll introduce him in a moment. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging that we are hosting this webinar from the lands of the Kaurna people. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all join us from today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the land and waters of Australia. So for our POTS for Practitioners webinar series, we are very fortunate to have Luke Hassan with us today. Luke is the lead dietitian of Active Health Clinic in Melbourne, where their mission is to make invisible illnesses visible by advocating for those with chronic invisible illnesses, including dysautonomia and POTS. He is passionate about making nutritional adequacy accessible for everybody, no matter their functional capacity, and helping those who too often fall into the too hard basket. Thank you for joining us today, Luke, and we really look forward to your presentation. And I think without further ado, we'll let you share your screen and we'll make ourselves invisible.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Celine. Good evening, everybody. I will just share my screen and then start the presentation. All right, that should be working just fine. Let me know if you can't see, otherwise I will get started. So yes, tonight, as part of the POTS for Practitioners series, I'll be presenting about nutrition and dietetics in dysautonomia and POTS. And really this is to answer a simple question. Why is it important? I would love first to acknowledge one of our other dietitians, Mel Grande at Active Health Clinic, who's helped me put this presentation together. She's been a massive part in everything that we've done to build the dietetic service at Active Health Clinic. And yeah, it's been awesome to build this, to share with you all with her this evening. I also want to acknowledge that while we've scoured the research for relevant information on nutrition and dietetics in POTS, we are still in the infancy of the research in this area. So many of the discussions we'll have are well referenced as well as they can be, but I will also reference when they are coming from anecdotal or clinical experience. Just a bit of an overview of today. A few things that we're going to talk about. Obviously, we're answering this question, why nutrition is important in POTS and for POTS patients. And we'll go through a couple of pieces of information, as well as some case studies, some nutrition education strategies, ways to go through a nutrition assessment with POTS patients, some interesting things that we need to know about and pick up on in those assessments, and then some common frequently asked questions from patients with POTS and their specialists. There is so much that we could go through today, and in talking with Claire and Celine, we've put it down to what is the most important things. There very well could be a few presentations on this of an hour and a half length, but we'll keep it to one for today and we'll see what happens in the future. So, why is nutrition important in POTS? As dietitians, nutritionists, people who specialize in this stuff, our goal is malnutrition prevention. In POTS patients, we have a more vulnerable population. And as much as I talk about the common POTS patient presentation throughout today, it's important to recognize that not every POTS patient will present like this. As always, we can't discriminate based on the way someone looks when they walk into our consult room or pop up on Zoom. And people who present looking differently to this example can still be at risk of malnutrition. So it's important to remember that when we're treating people, we're treating the whole person. We're looking at the whole picture. And when treating people with POTS, this is especially important, despite the fact that some will have common physical characteristics. We know that the symptoms of POTS actively contribute to issues with appetite, whether they are gastrointestinally derived, like whether they're actual GI complications. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But things like fatigue, brain fog, concentration difficulties, intolerance to standing, and decreased capacity for movement can all play a part in issues with access, cooking, and consuming food. There is also an acknowledgement in the research of the correlation between disordered eating patterns and POTS. But this research does acknowledge the distinction between patterns of eating disorder or disordered eating behavior in POTS patients because of their increased symptoms, and standalone disordered eating or eating disorders. We'll talk about this more when we speak about the assessment, but there is a study there, and all the references will be at the end of the presentation. So the second thing is to manage symptoms that we just talked about. Put simply, our bodies need adequate nutrition and hydration. And if this isn't taken care of, things get worse. We could talk about many examples of patients with POTS where that's been the case, unfortunately. Hydration and salt are best delivered as strategies by a dietitian, because we're the ones who will be able to go into the most detail and give patients the most confidence about salt use in particular, particularly with the general health messaging around sodium consumption, which again, we'll talk about in a little while. And I've listed, gastrointestinal symptoms here, and I'll talk more about these gastrointestinal concerns in POTS in a moment. But they are inevitably one of the biggest reasons why we need nutrition intervention in POTS patients. Plenty of evidence here to support the existence of gastrointestinal complications in POTS. One of the more severe contributors to these symptoms can be changes in gastrointestinal motility. So the two studies to the left of this screen talk to issues with gastrointestinal motility. One describes how of POTS patients affected with gastric or stomach dysmotility, 1/3 had gastroparesis or slow gastric transit, and 2/3 had rapid gastric emptying, which to me is very interesting because in most of the patients that I see with POTS who have gastric transit issues and are coming to see me because they're clinically significant, generally on the slower side. But this is what the research showed. Unfortunately, to my knowledge, this hasn't been followed up an awful lot. So we do need more evidence here. We need a larger study, more studies, just give us all the evidence here. And that'll always be the case for a long time here, I think, but very interesting read. And the second study talks about how the variability of small transit times in small bowel transit times in POTS operate, and how there might be an increase in small intestinal bacterial overgrowth or SIBO incidence in these patients. Again, really small study, initial research, but it's interesting and very good that the research is actually looking at these motility changes in POTS. There are, of course, many different things that we could talk about in terms of gastrointestinal tract and POTS. We'll talk about that much more as we go throughout, and these are just a few highlights. So we do know that a few conditions are definitely linked to POTS. You would be familiar, if you're around this space, of the hypermobility spectrum disorders or Ehlers-Danlos syndromes. I will refer to these as HSDs or HEDs from here. This is particularly well established. Gastrointestinal complications seem particularly prominent in patients who present with both HEDs and POTS. And this is backed up by the research on the right from 2020, so fairly recent. We're getting there with mast cell activation syndrome. This is a quote unquote rare condition, very rare, but MCAS is definitely something I see in the clinic in plenty of patients with POTS and EDS, and very rarely, I will say, with patients without one or both of those conditions. Not impossible, but that's where it's at. autism spectrum disorder, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ASD, ADHD. We have a paper here about ASD and autonomic dysfunction. We're getting there with the links on these things. Again, we are in the infancy. And another thing I wanted to mention, while this is completely anecdotal, and it's what I see in the clinic, I do see a lot of gynecological disorders in patients with POTS, with autonomic dysfunction, PCOS, endometriosis as comorbid conditions, and the gut complications that come with them. So with this, you have a very unique combination of abdominal symptoms that are sometimes hard to differentiate between. Nevertheless, nutritional recommendations do exist for these conditions separately. It will just be a fine balance between using nutritional strategies for each conditions. They tend to have a more symptomatic experience. They might have more suspected food intolerances, incidence of IBS-like symptoms, worsening of POTS potentially, but it's just important to note that these might be involved as well as you're looking at a POTS patient in front of you. And of course, our other invisible illnesses that we really focus on at Active Health Clinic, ME/CFS, chronic fatigue syndrome, chronic pain and pain sensitization, sleep disorders, as well as HEDs or HSDs and MCAS, as we mentioned earlier. And there is a reason why we take great interest in all of them at Active Health Clinic, because the vast majority of our patients will present with more than one of these conditions together. So we have to know the interactions between and throughout these. Cool. So with that as a bit of a background, a very brief background I might mention, let's head into some nutrition assessment considerations. So I'm going to go through the standard sort of A, B, C, D idea here. That was the way when I went through uni, we were taught to do this. Some other people might have different ways to do this in terms of the nutrition assessment, but hopefully it all links back together. So with anthropometry, we want to be very mindful of weight changes, including especially unexplained weight loss. We need to assess that. And I just want to flag here that it may not be appropriate to talk about the specifics of anthropometry with every patient in order to create a safe space for them to feel comfortable and to open up about what's really troubling them. As always, if we're going to talk about the specifics of weight or any other anthropometry, we need to gain informed consent and let the patient know that they're able to speak about weight or anthro in any terms that they're comfortable with. That's something we're really strong on at the clinic. But it is inevitably going to be important information to know. And sometimes, as I've put below, I'll actually do a bait and score. I don't have time to go through that right now if there's suspected hypermobility, and then perhaps conduct a further screening based on the updated HEDS 2017 criteria, which is an extension of the anthro skills that we're equipped with as dietitians. But if you're one of the first people that a patient with POTS has come into contact with, and you know hypermobility and you understand it, sometimes it can give you more information to add to their picture and give them further directions to help them in their global health journey, which is going to be super important. As I began with, we need to look at the whole person when we're assessing patients with POTS. As I discussed briefly earlier, many patients with POTS will present with disordered eating patterns, whether that be because of their POTS symptoms or otherwise. Some will actually have an eating disorder, and some will have symptoms that mimic eating disorders. And some are labeled with eating disorders by practitioners who don't know a whole lot about POTS yet, because, and I quote from a patient, they are young, thin, female, and it must be that. Using the questionnaires that I have on screen, so whether it's a simple SCOFF or whether you have access to the EDEQ, which there's a link to one by Inside Out just there, it can be a good starting point to providing other professionals in the team for this person information and evidence to help them to differentiate between a disordered eating secondary to POTS symptoms, or a comorbid eating disorder in POTS. Excuse me while I take a drink. I think it's pretty understandable that food would feel pretty daunting if we experience some of the symptoms that we're about to go through on a very regular basis. And this needs to be taken into consideration when we're seeing these patients. So, bit of biochemistry, iron and vitamin D, we have some good evidence on about potential deficiencies in POTS patients. I've also listed a couple of others there. In my experience, many with POTS find meat, animal flesh, really difficult to consume for a variety of reasons, whether it be sort of texture, sensory difficulties, whether it be because of gut motility or dysmotility, I should say, or whether they just don't like it. That's something as well. But in any case, it can limit the intake of some of the nutrients here if the diet's not curated properly for this, or adequate supplementation is not being instigated for these things. There is very interesting research going on right now about HEADs and vitamin C. So some POTS patients that I've seen who also have HEADs will have returned seriously low vitamin C scores, like basically 0, and in some cases 0. And I'm not sure how that's possible, but they've had the repeats done and they've been very low, either 0 or 1 or 2, and they've been diagnosed with scurvy. And some have also stated that very high intake of vitamin C can be beneficial for their symptoms, but there's absolutely nothing concrete here just yet. These are just observations that I've had in practice, and I've heard around the traps in these conditions. Be careful in patients who are supplementing with a lot of different formulations. A lot of them will contain B6 as an added filler or maybe a main ingredient, and this can be problematic at high doses for prolonged periods. And some of you might have actually heard about this in the news recently. I know the DA has put out a bit of information on this. Magnesium will commonly be brought up in a supplement conversation. I haven't got it listed here, but it will be. If a patient wants to supplement magnesium, make sure you know what they're trying to achieve from it. So are they trying to get better sleep? Are they trying to have less cramping or deal with restless leg? Are they trying to lower their heart rate? These are all things that patients will have heard. Of course, we know there's other ways to achieve this, but they'll potentially want to try magnesium. We just want to know why and how much, because we know that magnesium can have other unwanted effects, or maybe they are wanted effects for people like diarrhea or loose stools. Certain types of magnesium, I should say. There's a bit on significant gut symptoms. Just check if they've had any other investigations, particularly celiac screens or colonoscopy, endoscopy to check for IBD or celiac or anything around that. Sometimes there'll be significant reflux there. We need to get that checked out. And just a note on the bottom, the likelihood of patients coming in with results of, I guess, less common or more alternative tests is higher, in my experience, in this population than others. My recommendation here is that you read up on some of this alternative testing, potentially how to interpret it, or the latest research on a given test, if there is any, so that you know how relevant the results of a particular test are and feel confident explaining this to a patient. And I'll leave it there, but many patients come through with test results, some of these in front of me, of alternative testing, and will be heavily restricting their food intake because of said testing. And we figure out that that is unnecessary as we go. And we need to prevent this as much as possible. As I said, our first goal is preventing malnutrition, which is we are at risk of this in this patient group. So, other past medical history, other considerations. We might want to look at whether they've got hay fever, allergies, whether they've had rashes, random or known. Well, we know why the reason is eczema, urticaria, asthma. We want to check whether there might be a histamine intolerance present, whether there might be MCAS, a potential candidate, We want to check that, any other causes of significant gut symptoms that might be present. So whether it is a gynecological condition, whether it is another type of gut condition altogether, whether it's an autoimmune condition, we want to make sure that we know this. Something a bit off center, checking if there's been significant trauma to the head, neck, spinal region that could have impacted nerve input and sensitization is important. I could do a whole nother presentation on that, but there's plenty of people with better resources on that than me, but I'll just note it here. And as usual, we want to know all of those gut conditions, which I mentioned earlier, but food allergies, intolerances is really important. And anything that could impact food access or food intake, for example, any mental health conditions, ASD, ADHD, or any of our invisible illness cluster that I'd mentioned before, all really important things to know. And they may not automatically come out with these things because they're there to see for POTS, but this could all play a part in, as we know, their nutrition intake and their story. Fairly straightforward slide here. I like to know how often one of these symptoms is going on for the patient. So when I'm assessing gut symptoms, how often are you having it? Do they have any known triggers for that symptom? And what level of severity are they experiencing these symptoms? Obviously, this is going to be a subjective reading. I'll often use a visual analog scale to get some sort of subjective measurement. It's more for tracking for me. So I want to know how bad it is now, and then I want to be able to implement strategy, and then I want to see where they're at the end of the strategy, or once they've implemented it and we've waited the appropriate time period. It's so powerful for patients to be able to see that once they've gone through their journey with you, and we need to be showing impact as practitioners. It's my true belief. A small note here. So distinguishing between lack of appetite and early satiety is always important, but it's arguably more important in these patients. There is a huge difference between I don't get hungry and I can't eat very much at once. And this actually might help us understand and differentiate between what the patient is experiencing gastrointestinally or otherwise, and more about how to help them appropriately as well. This slide is straight out of our diet assessment form. So some people will come in not knowing the etiology of their conditions, perhaps thinking that all of their symptoms stem from one condition, where in actuality it might be 3 or 4, or the complete opposite. They might think they've got all this stuff, and it's actually stemming from one singular point. In any case, this list gives us a further opportunity to actually know more about their overall health, about the relationship between their concerns, based on what they do know about their condition and what they actually feel physically or otherwise day to day. And this will help us to get our management strategies in order to figure out how we're going to actually help this person. So diet history, we're all familiar, I hope. And if you're not a dietitian or a nutritionist, then essentially we're getting what they eat, when they eat it, and how much they eat. It's a cool part of the assessment. It's funny trying to do a diet history with all different age ranges and people. You'll get varying levels of historians, as you do in all modalities. But I actually very rarely get people to do a diet history or write their diet diary down for a couple of days before. I much rather having that conversation with a person in the room or on Zoom. I just feel that I get a better at the moment, and I don't want to say honest, but really clear view of what they're eating, going back a little while. They've not been prepped with, hey, I need you to write down your diet for 3 days before, so make it look good. That can be some people. It also won't be other people. I just like having that conversation in person was the point of that little spiel. We also want to know that whether since diagnosis of POTS or otherwise, or symptom onset, has there been a change in the food routine? How has that gone? And obviously you can link that back to things like anthro, and what other things impact the dietary intake. So patients with POTS, they'll often have fatigue, so they might be sleeping a lot. so many of my patients can't eat in the morning, which we'll talk about later, because of symptoms, but generally they're getting up about 11 or 12. That's important to know. Low interoception, or ability to feel hunger and satiety, which we'll talk about in management strategies again. And do they have support? Are they still, adolescents, teenagers, young adults with parents that are helping them? Do they live by themselves? Are they in a share house? What are some of the things that they have to contend with to get to food intake? All really standard stuff from a nutrition perspective, but very important because it's going to help you gauge exactly how you're going to help this patient get access to food within your ability. So something for dietitians, nutritionists in the room to pass on to referrers or whoever else, if you are interested in or do see patients with POTS, something for non-dietitians or nutritionists in the room to have a look at. These are what I'd consider red flags. There are probably more, but in conversation with Claire and with Celine, as we were building this, I put these down and they go, yep, that is 90% of our patients. It's just the way it is. Not everyone will need to see a dietitian when they live with POTS or get nutrition intervention when they live with POTS, but a lot will. And if you have any experience with POTS patients, you'll be able to see that in this slide. So that's really important. Take a screenshot if you want to talk about it, write it down, whatever. Yeah, that's why we're here. Most of the reasons. There will be others, as I said. Okay, cool. So we've done the assessment. We have all the information we need. What are we going to do with them? The first thing is that everything needs to be individualized. So all the strategies I'm about to go through, I will go through most of them, all of them, maybe with the majority of POTS patients. Some I won't, because they've got it either under wraps already or it's just not appropriate or applicable to them, and that's okay. It's important to note that this is not the be all and end all. These will help specifically with POTS. That's what they're designed to do. But other nutrition strategies that you might be able to bring from your own experience with other patients that don't have POTS may also be helpful here. So I hope that this gives you an idea about some things that you can incorporate, some things that are helpful, but also it might jog your mind to see, oh, I could adapt this thing that I do with other patients in this way. I am so passionate about seeing people with this condition and about helping these people that I just want this all to be out so we can all help these people as much as we can. So yeah, I'm very interested to see how what you all think of this, but this is what we do to help POTS patients in amongst other things. So hydration, as I mentioned before. Interesting question. Have you ever thought about the physics of a garden hose? So I use this analogy to explain to patients in a very simple way, and it may not be completely 100% physiologically correct, but it gets the point across about how the body is trying to compensate for blood flow, and why we essentially need to turn up the tap to get a more powerful stream at the end of the hose by increasing our fluid intake. In more specifics, increasing our fluid intake with potentially some sodium, which we'll get to in just a second. Hydration is important for everyone, but especially for these patients. And common questions I get: what if you don't like water? Well, pretty much any drinkable fluid, but alcohol is most likely to still be helpful. There are caveats on that, yes, as usual, but that's the general gist. A study published in 2016 looked at what the most hydrating fluids actually are and came up with some interesting answers. So number one, and I've got something different, but I believe because it surprised me. Number one was milk. Number two was the electrolyte drinks. And and skim and full cream milk sort of fell in there with the electrolyte drinks essentially, but I'm pretty sure this article actually stayed in milk first. Fourth was orange juice, and 5 was Coca-Cola, full-blooded, believe it or not. And whatever you think of the results of that study, it shows that other drinks are going to do what is needed if, for whatever reason, water is not appropriate. I don't actually know why, but a lot of my patients are very averse to drinking fresh water. Sometimes it's just because it's boring. I've had one patient who had a terrible experience with drinking water and taking their tonsils out, and they are sensitized to water. And it's taken us 2 years to get them to be able to have water. Again, we've slowly desensitized them through other drinks, right? Like other drinks will be able to do the trick. And there's a lot of strong opinions sometimes about this, but my firm belief is that we need to get them fluid in. And if we can do that, then we're winning. We're on our way. I've got one patient at the moment who has solo in the morning because they can't tolerate anything else. And okay. My most important tip for patients here is to take in about 500 ml of water before they get out of bed or other fluid. If that's too much as they possibly can now, and then progress to 500 ml. And if it's not water, then something hydrating. As I said, solo. Is it ideal? No. But right now, they're getting fluid in. It's able to get them up and into their day better, and that's important. Bit of conjecture about coffee or black or green tea, as well as other caffeinated beverages. Often I've found patients come to me and have restricted them or believe that they will need to restrict them. But if it's at like normal consumption, and I know that's a very not accurate term to be using, but something along the lines of 2-3 cups a day, and they're drinking enough other fluid, so they're having, I would say, at least 1 glass of water or electrolyte containing drink or some other hydrating fluid with it. It shouldn't matter too much, especially if they're not having like straight espresso shots. Like if they're having lattes or whatever, they're getting electrolytes and stuff in the milk with that. The shot is likely to be only a very small amount of that, and we should be able to get going. There may be other reasons why people restrict caffeinated beverages, and for health reasons or otherwise, and that's perfectly fine. You don't have to drink them. But if people are, I don't see it as the worst thing in the world. And of course, we need to be mindful of other nutritional components of drinks. Lots of sugar-free drinks have sorbitol and mannitol or other sugar alcohols in them. Some people will be intolerant to that. There's also a small note about actual energy content in drinks as well. And yeah, that's something we need to be mindful of. Absolutely. So salt or sodium. Salt is a big part of the conservative management strategies for many with POTS, and a dietitian is the best placed individual to help patients with their individual salt recommendations to assist them with POTS management. There are a few ways here that we recommend people get extra sodium by adding salt to food, simple enough, by having salty snacks and using electrolyte formulations. We have a link there to the electrolyte comparison document, which is something that Mel's curated of about 50 different electrolyte supplements compared on sodium concentration, carbohydrate content, price per 100 milligram of sodium, etc., to give patients a range of options when it comes to these electrolyte formulations. It is by no means an exhaustive list. We're adding to it all the time. We've got a revision coming up soon, but there is a link there. So hopefully that can be made available for everyone. But last, I give people, as a last resort, I'll give people the recommendation for salt capsules or tablets. These can be used to fill in deficits, but we don't love it because they can cause fluid migration to the gastrointestinal tract and all sorts of symptoms because of this. There are, of course, ways to mitigate that, and that might potentially be the best option for someone. But that is generally our last resort. But every single patient that we see will have a different percentage point of each of these 4 involved in their salt supplementation if they are supplementing sodium. This is important. Individual recommendations for those who find a benefit from salt supplementation start at about 4,000 to 6,000 milligrams of salt per day. But not everyone will need this much. and some will need more to find symptomatic benefit. There could be some contributions to this, but things like high blood pressure is interesting, and we need more research in this space to understand the proper mechanisms behind high blood pressure in POTS people themselves. It may be that in hyperandrogenic POTS or POTS with high blood pressure, salt isn't completely contraindicated as long as it's under very, very strict supervision. But again, further research needs to be done here. For most people with POTS, this fact remains that salt should be beneficial because of its physiological action. Sodium, I should say, should be beneficial. The other electrolytes can be included, but sodium is the one that we're really looking at. Simple way of getting people to have a look at their salt intake is if they put 2 teaspoons of salt in a container, Ziploc bag maybe, and use their food and drinks to get it all down in a day, that equals about 8 to 10 grams of salt, depending on how high they heat the teaspoon. And 10 grams of salt is approximately 4,000 milligrams of sodium. So that might be a way, not necessarily to get people to have more salt or less salt, but just for people to see how much salt they're consuming in a day, and realize, well, the standard recommendations are here. I'm consuming here, which is what happens with most people, because they go, that's a lot of salt. And you go, yes. But they'll also consume salt through their food just normally. They'll have electrolytes on board maybe as well. So if we get that bag down and then we're having other foods and it's fairly fairly non-processed or whatever we want to say about it, then maybe we're getting to that 6,000. The point is here, it's just one example, and everyone will have a different way to do this, and that's okay. So another strategy, I've called it calming the nervous system. And the first strategy is resting around meals, which might sound straightforward and even boring at first. But what we're trying to do is get the patient to focus on the eating occasion and actually make it something that they look forward to. Okay, something that gives them a break from the daily grind of living with a chronic illness, or an opportunity to practice mindfulness and pacing, which will help their condition globally in turn. We give them 2 very good reasons for this physiologically. We're prioritizing blood flow to the abdomen while we're going towards eating, and we're trying to move further towards parasympathetic nervous system upregulation, known aptly as rest and digest, which is potentially outdated terminology, but I really like it because it gives the patient an exact presentation of what we're trying to do through this strategy. This is one of my favorites. You'll see in the case study later. It's been really helpful, even though it seems really simple. Patients, I should say, might include other strategies with the resting around meals. They might meditate before and after. They might elevate their legs after they eat, as long as they're not flying flat on their back, because we don't want them to choke or aspirate, especially if they're prone to reflux or have difficulty swallowing. But that can be an addition as well to that strategy. Some patients will have also sensitized themselves to certain foods or food components, even water sometimes, as I mentioned before. And like I said, I could talk about sensitization in another complete other talk, but essentially it's a process of the body having an unnecessarily intense response to a perceived danger signal. And like I said, there's plenty of other resources out there on that topic, which will explain it much more eloquently than I will. But I'll often use the bathtub analogy to explain this to patients. So bathtub analogy, you're feeling if you've got intolerances or certain food issues, the more of that food or food component you put in over the day, we're filling the bathtub up. The plug's not great, so it takes a little while to drain, and eventually we get to 100%. The bathtub spills over, symptoms. But you can get in the bath at 25%, and you can kick the water in the bath, and the bath will still go on the floor like it's spilled, but the bathtub's not full. I don't know if that works for you, but it works for a lot of my patients in understanding that, hey, we can have with symptoms because we've been, having this food, but we haven't necessarily reached like the limit of having this food or food component. Our body is simply trying to protect us because it recognizes that this has been something that's been uncomfortable in the past. There's also a brief note there on vagus nerve stimulation. Essentially the highway between the gut and the brain, among many other things, but stimulating the vagus nerve through literal devices that actually activate the nerve from the external of the body, or exercises that stimulate its activity, rather, can help digestive symptoms and bring the body more towards parasympathetic function. Some of you might be aware of or familiar with polyvagal theory, which is a helpful tool to understand for patients to help understand why this nervous system component is important. But again, not the topic of tonight and another presentation in itself. Feel free to look more into it if you like. Okay, so appetite regulation and routine. The general story that I get from patients is, when I was in primary school, I ate a certain way. I got up, I had breakfast, I went to school, I had recess or fruit snack or whatever it was. I went back to class, I had lunch, went back to class, afternoon snack, and then dinner. And I want to acknowledge that not everyone had that routine, not everyone was privileged to have that access to food. But often when I see patients, that's the story that I will get. And then sometime in early high school, something gets in the way. So they'll become ill. They will have other things that are more important, whether it be sport or art or chatting with their friends or, people that they like, whatever it might be. Something will get in the way and disrupt that pattern. Maybe it's their long trip to school and back that started at high school. Maybe whatever it might be, something disrupts that regular eating pattern that they might have had for 6, 8, 10 years. And it starts the descent into, that usual 3 meals a day, quite large idea that we get to when we get to work, or some don't even get there, because as I've said before, lots of the people that we're going to see with POTS are going to be adolescents, young adults. But they end up with irregular eating patterns. And once something gets in the way, the body learns that it's okay to suppress the more modest signs of hunger. So the body will step up its game. It creates more powerful symptoms when it really needs food. Right? We'll have nausea, we'll get pain in the gut, we'll get a headache, we'll get lightheadedness, shakiness, mood changes, fidgety. But if I was to repeat those symptoms, you'd think I was potentially describing some of the symptoms of POTS. They can mimic each other. And this can lead to really strong danger signals being created around this vital communication that the body is trying to use to get us to eat, okay? So with almost every patient, we build an eating routine that's based on regulating appetite, regulating hunger, not trying to restrict it, but getting it to be more consistent. Because consistency in eating, there's two parts to this. There's the physiology of it and there's the habit of it, right? Will help people to have better interoception and ability to connect with the more gentle signs of hunger, which are above the noise, or perhaps they're below the noise, but we will teach people to perceive them, these signals by the body, above the noise of the symptoms. Okay, this has been developed and is inspired in part by the RAVES model, particularly the regularity and then adequacy steps, but it's also come from a bit of research that I've done around appetite regulation and routine. There are 2 guide points standing in this sort of appetite regulation cycle and consistent eating routine thing. When I first introduce it, I will tell a patient, I don't care what you eat or how much you eat at these times. So these are patients you've got to remember that are already having a lot of difficulty with consuming food regularly. They might be having 1 or 2 really small meals a day. They might have nighttime eating, and and not eat at all during the daylight hours, or it just might be very, very messed up. So I will say, I'll set up an eating routine. I'll make sure that it is workable with their schedule. And I'll say, I don't care what you eat, and I don't care how much you eat, as long as you have something at these times. And that takes a lot of pressure off the patient, because they're not expected to eat full meals or bigger snacks at these times. And sometimes it'll be as little as two almonds. I'll be like, great, awesome, you ate, great. The point is that we're trying to instill that routine in them, instill that habit. And generally, 2 to 4 hour windows between meals or snacks, depending on patient circumstances, work, school, otherwise, real intense nausea and sickness in the morning. Lots of people, and you'll hear this lots, I can't eat in the morning, I don't have any appetite, I can't get hungry, and that's actually okay. Of course, we'd like to work on that, but if the first time that they can eat is midday, then we start this from midday, and we make sure there's consistent eating throughout the afternoon and into the evening, so that they are nourishing their bodies correctly. Generally, I like a 2 to 4 hour window, depending on how small or large the meals need to be. It goes back to that basics or basic eating principle throughout primary school, trying to link that back up. And it's a really good analogy in patients' minds of where they want to get back to. The final strategy, pillars of nutrition in pots. This is another one of Mel's creations. Thank you. Really, really simple to help patients understand this sustainable plate model instead of the healthy eating model. I really like to neutralize terms like healthy and unhealthy, as patients will pathologize and hold on to these food-based language terms that we use. And they've been hearing it from doctors and other professionals, and perhaps their parents and people around them all their lives. And if we can get them away from that, I've seen that have really positive impact in patients. Using language such as sustainable energy or nutrient rich and nutrient poor, as I'm sure you're all aware. But really that just encompasses, making sure we have macros in each meal, making sure we've got fiber and micronutrients there as well. All really standard nutrition stuff, but framing it in a different way that makes it relevant and important for the patient to take hold, because they might have heard this stuff before. We want to make it different. We want to make it stick and help them to understand that doing this really actually has an impact on the way that food will sit in their body, so make them feel unwell or not unwell, and the way that they'll be able to use energy from that food, trying to get a more sustainable energy output from their meal, rather than having this really quickly digested food which spikes their energy potentially and then drops it back down. Similar concept with caffeine, which I touched on before, but explaining to patients that caffeine doesn't actually give your body real energy that it can use. It makes us feel like it does, but all it's doing is making us less sleepy. Like that sort of stuff needs to be clarified, because patients will be fatigued and they'll be searching for anything that sort of gets them through the day potentially. So, case studies. Let's dive into that, and I'll run through them pretty quickly because I understand we're getting to about the halfway point and we've just got there. So yeah, cool. Case study number 1, Miss E. I saw Miss E in November to begin with. They're 17 years old. They're heading into year 12 next week. That's their conditions. They're being investigated currently for HEDs and gastroparesis. These were their goals. Really, really quite simple. Really quite simple. This is a bit of information about them. So at the end of 2020, they were about 10 kilos heavier. They put that down to eating lots in COVID and being in lockdown in Melbourne. Fair enough. But getting back to some more usual routines and schedules, they fell back to their resting weight. They are very tall. You'll see later, I saw this patient this afternoon, and they wear these boots that are like 6 or 7 centimeters heel on them, and it just, it makes me feel really short. But that's okay. They're great. They aren't on too much medication. They didn't have an awful lot of gut symptoms. Their appetite was poor, but it was stable. So they were eating very consistently, just not a lot. And that's pretty standard So the purpose of Miss E is to show you, I guess, a patient who is still in needing of nutritional care, but on the less severe end of what we can see within POTS patients. And then the next case study will be the other end, as I'm sure you'll figure out. As I said, the other symptoms that they experience, you can see them there, and they all inevitably will make food access difficult or make accessing good food. Not to use the word good, but food that's going to be really sustaining for them, and made it difficult. This was their diet history. So as you can see, coffee was breakfast. They'd have a snack. Lunch was really, I guess, a main meal. It was pretty small, as you can see, and then dinner, pretty small, but fairly standard stuff. They might have had 1 litre of water a day, plus maybe a cup of coffee and a cup of Powerade, but they weren't every day, or coffee maybe was, but that was their day food, and that was pretty consistent, which is good. It's good to have a consistent food intake, but with this patient's goals, we wanted to increase their appetite. They have a goal about muscle mass, which is fine, and they're going to increase their weight a little bit through that. Then that's great. Here's a nutrition impression. Now, I've not worked in hospital for many years, so probably not a PES or a PASS statement exactly, but it works. And yeah, 9 kilos it was exactly. I double checked with the doctor. And they did lose most of it in 2022 when they were back at school, back in like regular routine in life. And yeah, that was their difficulty. So this is what we planned. We went through the POTS eating strategies, which I listed specifically here. The appetite regulation, cycle and eating routine, and we wanted to work on building muscle mass with appropriate dietary modifications. So those pillars of POTS nutrition, increasing variety and volume of food as the appetite increased. So as I said, I saw Miss E today. They are the same weight, but their activity levels have also increased. So what we've noticed is that over the last couple of months, this patient has started to drink more. So they're up to 2 litres of water a day, with about 1 litre of those being electrolytes. They are exercising more. They've got more activity, more movement. So things that they couldn't have done 3 months ago, they're doing. They went to an 18th last night. They are running with their dog a few days a week and walking the rest of the days. So we've evened stuff out. But their diet history today essentially was having a really sustainable breakfast. So they're having oats with some yogurt, some fruit, or a smoothie, which we're adding some protein powder to. They are having lunch, which will be essentially double what that serving was in the other couple slides. So they're having 2 pieces of sushi instead of 1, or they're having a full bowl of noodles instead of half. And then they're having an afternoon snack, which will be some fruit or some veg with some dip, potentially some cheese. We introduced today something that apple and then Biscoff, and they like sprinkling salt on that, and they're loving it. Cool, works. And these, and then having dinner with the family, and mum reported that that Miss E was actually eating a full plate of food most nights, which is great. So now we're just working on meal quality, well-rounded eating occasions, and making sure that those changes can be implemented into the school year, which is something that I see lots, especially year 11 and 12. They're doing pretty good over the summer. They get to school, everything falls apart. So I like to see people perhaps a couple of weeks after they've started school, just to make sure that all the things that we've implemented and working well for them in the holidays start working well for them when they enter this really important period in their schooling. So case study B. Ms. D is a 28-year-old female who had symptom onset in April 2021. They've got quite a bit going on, including an atonic bladder. So they've been recently catheterized. Severe gastroparesis, hypoglycemic episodes, the POTS autonomic failure. This patient, when they started to see me, and you'll see on the next slide, they've lost 20 kilos since symptom onset, and a lot of function with that. they wanted to avoid a feeding tube if they could. They were very afraid. And the first sort of session that we had after this initial was me explaining the process go away and helping them to understand and be more comfortable if that was where we got to, that things would be okay and that would actually be beneficial for them if we figured out that that's what they needed. They wanted to try and manage to eat and drink more than what they could now, and wanted to try and maintain their weight where it was. So they started out in April 21 at 71 kilos or so. Now, or 51 in September. They wanted to be up pushing 60 again. So that was where they wanted to be. As is very usual, endoscopy, colonoscopy, standard bloods, all been done. Came back fine. This was in September. Some things had changed by the time we got to December or so, but this was when I first saw this person. Lots of meds, lots of pain meds you'll see. Again, I don't have time to go into all the different drugs that can be used in this condition, nor is it within my scope, but these are very common drugs in someone with pain, someone with POTS. So this patient had very intense gut symptoms. So the nausea was a 6 to 7 out of 10 at baseline and would escalate to an 8 or a 9 with no relief. So they've tried, all your usual antiemetic remedies, no relief. I've tried some conservative stuff, no relief. The pain and discomfort in the gut was also constant, worse after eating and drinking. Very, very constipated individual, would go to the toilet roughly fortnightly. And I think that was a reflection of the gut function, but also a reflection of just the little that they were eating. They feel that the body rejects food and fluid, which is really hard to hear from a person, but it's definitely a very real thing for people to feel. They, as you'll see in the diet history, they manage mouthfuls at a time. Very severe symptoms, and you can see some of the explanations here. And all of this would be pretty scary to live with on a daily basis. So Ms. D, although they're pretty unwell, they present pretty cheery. They'll tell you exactly what they're feeling and thinking, but they present pretty cheery, which is, I think it's incredible. Diet history here. As you can see, we're talking like 3 tablespoons of intake and half a cup of drinks max. Lunch is half a hot chocolate. And then we're getting like 8 to 10 small mouthfuls at dinner. The main reason why they've structured food like this is to make sure that their medication, some of which needs food, can be consumed with an adequate amount of food in their stomach. That's it. And there was no extra fluid being consumed that's not in here. So very limited amount of fluid, which is already going to be difficult enough for anyone, but in a patient who's living with POTS, it becomes all the more important, and it simply wasn't enough for this patient, but that's all they could handle in a day. Oh, excuse me. I'm going to skip that because I didn't, left the name, so we're just going to leave that. But essentially, you can gather what the nutrition intervention will be there. The plan was this. So we wanted to try and get an oral nutrition supplement to work. They tried many in the past, many, and they just hadn't worked. So there were a couple that hadn't been tried, particularly elemental feed, which I wanted to give a go. POTS eating strategies, as we talked about before, but much of it was irrelevant because there was such a little intake there. And like I said, the second session was literally just us talking about feeding tube as an option and calming the fears that are associated with it. We wanted to also think about, compression syndromes, NAILS being one of them, that's or MCAS, but I spoke to others on the team, and this person's been well investigated by people in the know. And I guess we put that to the side for now. The priority was really just trying to get this patient's symptoms under control and their nutrition up so that they could stabilize and then gain weight. So I have heard from Ms. D today, and pretty much what we tried in the process was between September and now, we tried to get more oral fluid in. I tried to do something I call mini shot strategy. So essentially, I was getting I got Ms. D to it was 30 mil and tried to do that once an hour. But there's such dysmotility there that once an hour is still too much and 30 mil is still too much. Thankfully, since due to some very hard work by treating team, she's recently been approved for home IV fluid therapy and is getting 2 liters a day at the moment, which is amazing. We attempted the elemental ONS, which I talked about before, but it was no good. Any sort of liquid, it wasn't what it was. It was something going in. So we spent a bit of time just maintaining and trying to maintain while exploring different enteral and parenteral options. And today, as of today, I got an email just before here that Miss D has been accepted to begin TPN, which is incredible because really the gut is not functioning, and it's what they need to make sure that they get better and that they at least stabilize. So good outcome here. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. And there will be other complications that prevent TPN sometimes. Sometimes people will be intolerant to some of the components of that, and we've got to work around that. And yeah, we've been pretty blessed to have this come through for Miss D. So hopefully there'll be a good outcome to this case. But I just wanted to detail the contrast between types of POTS presentations that you could get. And I think these 2 cases are really quite quite a good representation of that. So briefly, because we've just hit an hour, but briefly I'm going to go through some assorted frequently asked questions, just a couple, and I'm not going to give them in as much detail as probably what they deserve for the sake of time, but just a couple of things that you're going to get asked by a patient about what to do with nutrition in POTS. So carbohydrates, such a vital yet evidently controversial topic within diet talk, and I don't think it needs to be. It's our body's preferred fuel source for a reason. As you can guess by me saying that, you can probably guess my standpoint on the first question. I'll refer back to the sustainable plate model from an earlier slide in terms of my answer here. We do find that many with POTS and fatigue-like symptoms associated with that benefit from the well-rounded meals idea that are not overly laden with higher glycemic index carbohydrates, for sure, absolutely. But I also have the standpoint that if that's what they eat in a certain moment, I'd certainly rather them eat it than not, because we need food in. We just need it. A few patients who have done the sort of low carb or keto thing before coming to see me have reported it to be helpful, and I've supported them in maintaining that and making sure their intake is adequate, and that's awesome for them. But I've certainly not recommended it to anyone. And this has to do with more the overall picture of invisible illness and specific reasons within that why I wouldn't recommend this to someone with POTS or chronic fatigue syndrome. But in short, the evidence is really preliminary and in some cases just not there and doesn't say anything that it works. So that's where it is right now, and I'm awaiting to see what happens, and I think people will end up looking into this because it's such a common thing that's seen and such a common question by patients. As for fiber, this can be difficult. I've actually had a question from a specialist for today, and it says most of our cohort don't find fiber beneficial as it tends to worsen bloating with dysmotility. What do you recommend in these patients to improve regularity of bowel movements? That was their question. So if we can regulate the intake and get it as close to nutritional adequacy as possible with a well-rounded various diet, often this will really help with bowel movements. When we can't do that, like in cases of really disordered motility, we need to make sure that hydration is up to scratch first. Understand if any specific fibers are being avoided within a patient's diet. For example, grains, really common, as I said. Well, lots of people talking about the carb thing. So avoiding grains and soluble fiber, but not necessarily vegetables or largely insoluble fiber. I understand there's crossover there, but I might look at something like ground flaxseed in this case, or a product called Flowy or Flow, which seem to be more effective in POTS patients in regulating stool, not necessarily contributing to looser stools, although they can do that, or more compact stools, although they can do that. And this is something that I've seen across patients who've come through with just straight IBS as well, irritable bowel syndrome. So I will generally go to those things, but really I'm trying to get the diet as nutritionally adequate as possible, and as much variety in it as possible to help with this. As for gluten, that's another fun topic. There's still not enough evidence that restricting it is helpful in POTS. We need more research on this. Anecdotally, some have found benefit, but a gluten-free diet is a bigger undertaking than some people would believe. If you know someone who has celiac disease, like my mum is, which is the reason why I went into dietetics altogether, you know that can be quite difficult for many. Any sort of restriction should be an option of last resort in these patients. And sometimes it's not about what you eat, but it's actually about how you're eating. I wrote a brief patient resource on this last year, which we turned into a book. It's called Eat What You Want, very flashy title, but essentially it talks about the really basic first points of modifying how you're eating to try and get a better outcome in terms of how you feel after you're eating. And POTS patients are a perfect example of where this can come in handy. So non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Does diet play a role? Lots of patients that come through with POTS will also have NAFLD. And I don't claim to be an expert in the area of NAFLD, definitely not. But these suggestions that are here, so there's a bit of information there, but the suggestions that are here, they will help, and they should help, but they might be easier to say to a patient than for the patient to actually put into practice with POTS, unfortunately. So I still think this is an area where we need to look into more, and potentially diet will be a larger role in this, but it's really hard to try and get someone to be, lower GI carb, increase protein and fiber, smaller meals more frequently, exercises when they're struggling to eat at all. Some of those steps will be key to helping them get more food in, but we've got to try and get that happening first, I think. So one of my most common patient questions, should I go vegan? Forgive me for 1 second. I'm just gonna quickly wipe my nose. Again, I've talked a lot about restriction being the last resort. It's difficult in Gen Pop, let alone in chronic illness. So my short answer is no, but there's nothing wrong with it, okay? We know that we can structure a vegan diet and have it include all the things that we need to include and be very adequate. And if patients committed to that and you're committed to helping them with that as their dietitian nutritionist, then cool, no worries. We know there are benefits to a more plant-based diet, provided that the diet is undertaken with adequate alternatives, introduce the vital nutrients that might be missed within a largely plant-based or vegan diet. And if we've done that, then it shouldn't be an issue. But you don't have to You don't have to go vegan to help with POTS. That's a really important thing to say. And I think just to finish off, a lot of these questions have come from, like some have come from specialists, and I mentioned that, but some really come from patients who are just searching for answers. They're searching for answers. They want to help themselves. And that's one of the best parts of working with people in this population. They want to help themselves for the most part. And that's why I really value working with this patient population and all of their invisible illnesses. But you're gonna get some curly questions sometimes. And being well armed for them is good. So in conclusion, before we open up questions, nutrition is important in POTS. I think I've demonstrated that. I hope I have anyway. There are several extra pieces of information that we need to take into consideration when we're assessing the nutrition of a patient with POTS. Red flags for nutrition intervention are really common in POTS patients, really common. And I'll refer back to that slide earlier. And it's really important that we have specific and targeted nutrition intervention, particularly optimizing for hydration, salt, gastrointestinal function. As for many patients with POTS, this will be mandatory, necessary, incredibly important, imperative for them to achieve nutritional adequacy. And this will help them in their overall function and how they're able to approach their condition on a day-to-day basis. There's some resources there from some of the studies that I've listed to begin with, and you'll get access to this. And lastly, as I've said a couple of times, I am always looking to work with, we are always looking to work with people who are passionate in this area, who love helping patients with POTS, dysautonomia, other invisible illnesses. So if you have any questions that can't get answered tonight, or you want to work with us and support us in this goal that we have of reaching people and helping people with these conditions, please get in touch. Thank you very much for listening, and yeah, let's go from here.
Thanks a lot, Luke. That was an excellent presentation and really helpful. Lots of questions to go through, so I'll just throw a few of those to you.
Sure.
So one of the latter ones, which I think is really important, is what is the differential diagnosis between POTS and eating disorders? As certainly all of the POTS symptoms could be symptoms of low BMI and inadequate energy intake. And that's a question that we get a lot in this clinic, and there's a lot of crossover. So I'd be interested to hear your response to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I just clarify, the question was around the differential, the way we differentiate the diagnosis?
Yeah, so really pulling out, how do we know when someone has POTS or whether their symptoms are a result of inadequate nutrition?
Yeah, for sure. I think, okay, well, to clarify that point, their symptoms could be affected by inadequate nutrition, and that could be a minor or a major player in their symptoms because they've got POTS. So we've really got a chicken or an egg argument here. The way to differentiate between whether their symptoms of POTS have caused that inadequate intake and have caused the eating disorder presentation or the disordered eating presentation, or whether the disordered eating presentation has contributed to their POTS symptoms, and which way that table turns, because likely there'll be, when we're seeing them, there'll be an element of both. But to differentiate that, I refer back to those questionnaires that we had earlier in the presentation, because that can give you a look into, especially the EDEQ, that Eating Disorders Evaluation Questionnaire. I think that's what the second E stands for, but you'll be able to see that. That will give you a look into the mind of someone and some of their attitudes towards food and some of their preferences, or some of the things that they've built up over time that tell us more about the mental standpoint they have towards food, rather than the physical standpoint and what their physical limitations are because of food. So they're very well, at a point that we see them, it might be like this, but where it started might be important, and that's a way that you get a look into the mind of where it started. Often I see patients who present like this, and Mel would testify to this as well, and they go, I love food, I want food, I need food, but I can't.
Yeah.
Can't eat. It is so intense, these symptoms, it hurts. And unfortunately, they've either not relayed that well enough, or the doctor hasn't believed them when they relate it, or whatever, and we've gotten to this point where we're questioning this. So I've definitely seen patients who have answered that questionnaire, and it's been clear that, yeah, okay, we've had something preceding these symptoms, and we need to get a hold of that as well, and that requires a referral on and not a completely different mode of treatment, but some other things in that treatment plan. But some, you can see clearly through their answers that they don't have disordered eating thoughts. They are not presenting with some of the typical eating disorder thinking patterns or behavioral patterns. And that is a really good way to differentiate.
Yeah, it is. And I think from a clinician point of view, we, so Celine and myself work in a clinic from a nursing and cardiac point of view. So we won't speak to the dietetics of it, but we see a lot of people crossing over with eating disorder.
Yeah.
And we would usually, there's two things that we would look at. One is the autonomic system dysfunction, and typically in someone who's malnourished, and particularly if they're poorly hydrated as well, you'll see an orthostatic drop in blood pressure associated with the tachycardia and the symptoms. But it's not so usual to see a sustained blood pressure, or indeed a hyperadrenergic response in an increase in blood pressure on standing with tachycardia. That is a pretty defined, what's the definition of POTS, and it is pretty unique to that autonomic dysfunction. Also, I'd be looking for associated symptoms of things like poor sweating or hyperhidrosis or hypohidrosis, as well as some of the temperature regulation control issues and the pupillary reflex issues, because all of those should be external to an eating disorder but are more present in POTS. So, and it would heighten your significance of suspecting POTS in those patients.
And I think that highlights the real need for that multidisciplinary care and someone who's specialised in it from a medical point of view, as well as our allied health practitioner in this space and in this situation.
Yeah, that's right. It definitely needs multidisciplinary care. So another one, any tips for gastric emptying? I had a client the other day, I thought she had delayed gastric emptying, but it turned out she had rapid gastric emptying. I've got something to say about this, but I'll let you have a talk. Luke, I'm interested to hear about your thoughts about gastric dumping.
Yeah, for sure. So we head back to carbohydrates as a conversation. We want to make sure that those meals are really well rounded, really sustained. We don't want to have those high glycemic index carbohydrate meals going in. That is probably one of the times where we'll switch out foods for a patient and try and give them something that's going to just sit in the tummy for a little bit longer with that equal amount of energy input. I am also likely to create really small but frequent, so maybe even more frequent than that 2 to 4 hour mark that we talked about before. I've had a patient with rapid gastric emptying. It's been like every 45 minutes to an hour, something really small, because otherwise they would get some of those really, and I'm not actually sure whether to call it actually hypoglycemic or reactive hypoglycemic effects. So they've been super high fat, higher protein, still got carbohydrates in them, but they've been probably higher in those other two.
Yeah. So for those of you who aren't really familiar with the POTS research in this area, as Luke said at the start, there's not a whole lot of dietary and indeed GIT literature out there, but what there is does actually point to the fact that gastric dumping is more common in autonomic dysfunction than gastro or gastroparesis. There is some conjecture around that in terms of the hypermobile EDS presentation and where the pyloric sphincter is too relaxed in these patients, allowing for gastric dumping, which of course can lead to the reactive hypoglycemia, which we do see in a a large amount of our patients, which is interesting because most of them crave carbohydrates. So
Yes.
it is a complex thing. Most people look for gastroparesis, but in fact, I think in our experience, gastric dumping is probably more likely what you're going to be seeing.
Absolutely.
I'll just move on. So this is really interesting in the context of the case study you presented, but do you find that commencement of enteral or parental nutrition in this patient population is difficult to advocate for? Yes. Okay.
Yes. Yep.
Any tips on advocacy, particularly clients whose weight may have stabilised within healthy BMI despite significant unintentional weight loss from their previous stable weight? And that is just so many of our patients. I'm interested to hear.
So many of our patients, and one of the frequently asked questions that I didn't put in there because I didn't have time, I don't think, was what if you're seeing a POTS patient who lives in a larger body, or
and
who
we
has
see lots of those,
lots of them.
Yeah.
Yep. And I didn't include it, not because I didn't feel it was important, but because I didn't feel I had the time to actually really unpack that properly. But this is something we see a lot, and I think as a dietitian, as a nutritionist, an allied health practitioner, one of the blessings that I've had is really good people like Claire and Celine and other practitioners here in Melbourne who understand these conditions a little bit more to refer them to, and then work with. I got a couple of gastros who are much more willing than others. But in terms of advocacy, I think pointing out the guidelines of malnutrition. So looking at, yes, okay, we've got the healthy BMI, but there are other parameters within malnutrition that we need to look at, one of which being that unexplained weight loss. We can do muscle wastage, we can do comparison of anthro if the person is comfortable with that. We can also look at their ability to eat now versus what it was then, and understand the drop in intake over time. Okay, so if they've got a stable intake and it's maintaining, then presumably, and it's adequate and it's maintaining, presumably we can work that back up with oral intake. But the inference here in the context is that they're still not eating adequately, and they're still they might have stabilized weight, because that can happen sometimes when we lose a lot of weight, but their nutrition is not adequate. So we need to actually have that intake data there as well. It can be really difficult, really difficult. And in fact, I wish I had Mel to jump on and explaining this, because she deals with a lot of these patients, and some of the letters that she's written and the conversations that she's had with doctors is so eloquent, and she's got some really good results with that. Otherwise, we've just looked around for other people who are willing to listen.
And I think I'll just reiterate Luke's point that multidisciplinary care really helps. So from our point of view as a cardiology unit, when we've got patients who we are convinced have POTS-related significant malnutrition, having a very detailed letter from Luke, even though he's in another state, but sees our patients, and our patients see dietitians here too who are helpful. But those letters really support the advocacy on both parties to the third-party doctor who's looking after them. And I know that when we've engaged with dietitians in that way, it certainly has helped in anything that we speak into the gastrointestinal world. So it's a slow move, but I think there's certainly a lot of education getting out there. I saw some guidelines from the UK on gastric dysmotility, where they mention now at least hypermobile EDS, and there's some recommendations there for it, and some acknowledgement that a third of patients who present to eating disorder units are likely to have hypermobility syndromes and dysautonomia. And that is really kind of moving that along, and I've been able to send those guidelines along to some of those doctors, so that's helpful. Yeah, I like this next one, Luke, just to change the tone. A lot of my patients swear by beer as a hydrating drug. Obviously, we want to discourage alcohol, but would zero alcohol beer be an option?
potentially look at the electrolyte content if possible. I have contacted a couple of very well-known beer manufacturers who produce zero alcohol beer, and their electrolyte compound content of those beers are vastly different. So it matters what non-alcoholic beer they're having, and it matters because we're still getting the same amount of fluid in. Presumably it could be isotonic if the levels are right, and in that case it would be okay. There are also brands of sports beer which are low alcohol but have electrolytes infused in them. Now, I'm not privy to the exact numbers on the diuretic effect of alcohol versus the electrolyte, the fluid retaining effect of sodium, and how that directly relates in these products, but potentially that might be a better option, and we're also looking for the better option. But straight beer, I don't know if I can justify that. Yeah.
I think we'll have one more question and then we'll wrap it up. So we talk a lot about sodium, but given the relationship between sodium and potassium, do we need to be cautious of high potassium intake?
In most people, yeah, okay. So in most people, my answer would be no, primarily because we're going to get potassium through food. We're going to get potassium through electrolyte products that we're consuming. We're going to get it, potentially in quantities that are able to be adequate in that 4,000 to 6,000 milligram range. Because I think if we think about it, most people consuming a Western diet are not consuming under that 2,700 milligram standard dietary target that we have for the general population. Most are consuming far greater than that, if not on all days, on some days, and we're okay. It's okay. So that would be my pointer. If we're getting up like higher sodium, which some can, then maybe we want to consider that.
Yeah, and just to note that a lot of the POTS patients might be on fludrocortisone, which actually does have an effect on the potassium levels, and so they need to be monitored in that context. Yeah. In any case. Yeah. So thank you to those who put questions through. We're going to wrap up that question time now. Luke, I'm wondering, you provided some links in there, and also you talked about a 2016 paper that some people have asked the reference for. Yes. So we might be able to provide some of that out to the participants at the, we'll get that out to you via email in the next few days. And so I just want to really thank you, Luke, for taking the time. We really appreciate it. The community appreciates it. And so on behalf of the POTS Foundation, we'd like to thank you. We'll just turn this back on. That's right. To everyone out there, we send out some evaluation forms, and we really, really value your feedback on those. So look out for those in the mail, and that will help both Luke and ourselves to know what you're really wanting to see in the next seminars coming up. I really want to make you all aware that our next webinar is actually going to be Dr. Lawrence Afrin, and I'll actually just share our screen really quickly so that you can see this. But Dr. Afrin is actually coming to Australia in March. He'll be doing a tour of the Eastern Board, and during that tour, he's going to present our next webinar, which will be on March the 29th at 7 p.m. Adelaide time. That webinar is open to both the community and to practitioners. He'll be discussing mast cell activation disease or syndrome. If you're not familiar with his work, he's right at the forefront of describing this syndrome and this disease, and in fact was a lead author on the International Consensus 2 on mast cell activation syndrome, which crosses over a lot with some of the gastrointestinal symptoms that we see in our patients. It's a common feature that we see in POTS and HEADS. So you're welcome to go and register. The Humanitix is up live, and you can use that QR code there now to scan in and see that. I think that's pretty much everything that we've got to say, Celine.
I think so.
So we'd just like to thank you all for your time. It's great to see so many people interested in POTS, and we look forward to seeing you all at the next webinar, or at least seeing your names. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Luke.
Bye.